The morning Catherine walked into Meridian Mall for what she believed would be a routine shift, the sky outside was the color of old silver, not quite storm, not quite calm, that restless in-between that sometimes settles over a city before something changes everything. She noticed it only briefly, the way you notice something your body understands before your mind catches up. Then she pushed through the glass doors and let the familiar hum of recycled air and polished floors swallow her whole. She had worked at Prestige & Company, the mall's flagship luxury boutique, for 3 years. 3 years of folding cashmere sweaters with care, of memorizing the names of regulars, of learning which perfume samples certain customers preferred before they asked. 3 years of doing her job well, and doing it quietly, because Catherine had learned early that quiet competence was the only kind that didn't threaten anyone. It was a lesson she had never stopped resenting, even as she obeyed it. The boutique sat on the second floor of Meridian, visible from the atrium below through a wall of glass that made it look like something elevated, curated, intentional. The whole mall had been designed to give that impression, wealth displayed not through excess but through restraint. Clean lines. Marble floors. The kind of emptiness between objects that says, we do not need to fill the space. It speaks for itself. Catherine spoke for herself too, when given the chance. The problem was the chance rarely came. Her manager, a woman named Cecile, had made that clear in ways too subtle to report and too consistent to ignore. The slight hesitation before assigning Catherine to high-profile client appointments. The way compliments were always softened, you did well today, considering. The meetings where Catherine's suggestions were absorbed into silence, then surfaced later in someone else's voice as if born there. None of it was dramatic. All of it accumulated. That morning, Cecile had called Catherine into the back office before the store even opened, her expression carrying the particular satisfaction of someone delivering news they've rehearsed. There had been a complaint, she explained. A client, one of their regulars, a woman named Mrs. Hartwell, had said Catherine was too assertive during a fitting appointment 2 days prior. She had recommended against a purchase the client was considering, citing the fit. Mrs. Hartwell had left without buying. Cecile folded her hands on the desk and looked at Catherine the way you look at a problem you've been waiting to formalize. Our role is to serve, Cecile said, not to advise. Catherine sat with her back straight and her hands still in her lap, which was the only protest available to her. She thought about the dress. She thought about how the seam had pulled across Mrs. Hartwell's shoulder in a way that would have worsened with movement, how a woman of her standing deserved to know that, how saying nothing would have been the real disservice. She thought about all of this and said none of it. Understood, she said instead. Cecile smiled the way people smile when they've confirmed something they already believed. The boutique opened at 10. By 10:15, Catherine was back on the floor, folding, straightening, being exactly what the space required her to be, precise, pleasant, invisible. She had nearly convinced herself the morning would pass unremarkably when the first ripple moved through the mall. She felt it before she saw it, a shift in the air, the way sound behaves differently when something disrupts the usual pattern. Conversations dropped a half register. Footsteps changed rhythm. Even the boutique's ambient music seemed to briefly acknowledge that something had entered the building that did not belong to its ordinary logic. She looked toward the atrium below. There were men first. 4 of them, moving with the coordinated stillness of people who had learned long ago that power does not need to announce itself through speed. They were dressed well, not in the way of people trying to impress, but in the way of people who dress well because their world has always required it. They spread naturally across the atrium's perimeter, not blocking anything, not threatening anything, simply present in a way that restructured the geometry of the space around them. And then there was the man they surrounded without appearing to surround. Vladimir Kozakov did not walk into Meridian Mall so much as he arrived in it. There was a difference, and Catherine registered it instinctively, even from the distance of the second floor. He was tall, with the kind of build that comes not from display but from endurance, shoulders that carried weight without appearing to carry it, a stillness in his posture that suggested he had never in his life needed to prove he belonged somewhere. His suit was charcoal. His expression was unreadable. His attention, she noticed, moved through the space methodically, not looking for anything in particular, but cataloging everything. He did not look up at the second floor. Not yet. Catherine pulled her gaze away and returned to the sweater she had been folding. She smoothed the fabric twice more than necessary and reminded herself that whatever was happening in the atrium below had nothing to do with her. People like that moved through spaces like this sometimes. They bought things or they didn't. They left. The world returned to its shape. She was wrong, but she didn't know that yet. The rumors reached the boutique before noon. They moved the way rumors do in enclosed spaces, through a word dropped between employees during a task, a look exchanged across a register, the particular quality of a whispered conversation that tries and fails to contain itself. The mall had been sold. Not a store. Not a lease agreement. The entire building, Meridian Mall, all 4 floors, every boutique and corridor and atrium and loading dock, had been acquired. The transaction had apparently been completed weeks ago, but the announcement had been withheld. Nobody knew for what purpose. Nobody knew by whom, not officially. But the name was already circulating by the time Catherine went to take her break, Kazakov. She sat alone in the employee lounge with her coffee and turned the name over quietly in her mind. She was not naive about what the name implied. She had grown up in a city where certain surnames functioned less as identity and more as geography. They marked territory, indicated proximity to kinds of power that didn't appear in annual reports or press releases. The Kazakov name in particular carried a weight that most people understood without being told directly. It was the weight of a world that operated parallel to the visible one, that moved money and influence through channels that didn't bear examination, that solved problems through methods that left no documentation. She had never been close to any of that. Had never wanted to be. Had constructed her life with deliberate distance from anything that reminded her of how fragile ordinary safety could be. And now that name was attached to the building she spent 8 hours a day inside. She finished her coffee. She went back to work. She reminded herself again that this had nothing to do with her. It was 2 in the afternoon when he came to the second floor. She was with a customer, a younger woman trying to decide between 2 handbags, when she became aware of the shift in the boutique's atmosphere. The other staff moved differently. Cecile appeared from the back office with her shoulders adjusted upward. Even the customer beside Catherine seemed to register something, glancing toward the entrance with mild curiosity. Vladimir Kazakov entered the boutique with the same unhurried certainty he had moved through the atrium that morning. One of the men from earlier remained at the entrance, the others were presumably distributed elsewhere. He moved through the space without appearing to need anything from it, his gaze passing over the displays with the particular attention of someone evaluating rather than admiring. Cecile reached him first, her smile recalibrated for the occasion to something warmer and more deliberate than what she offered ordinary customers. Catherine watched from the periphery of the room, attending to her customer while tracking the interaction in her peripheral vision. She saw Cecile extend her hand. She saw Kazakov accept it briefly, his expression unchanged, not rude, not warm, simply neutral in the way of someone who does not perform social ease because they have never needed to. She saw Cecile begin to speak, gesturing toward the displays, slipping into the particular cadence of someone trying to demonstrate value. He listened. He did not lean in. He did not nod encouragingly. He simply received what was being offered and gave nothing back to confirm it had landed. Then his gaze moved. It moved through the room in that same methodical way she had observed from the atrium, and for a moment it passed over the area where she was standing with her customer, and she had the strange, uncomfortable sensation of being seen. Not noticed. Seen. There was a difference, and she felt it in the back of her neck, a slight awareness of being placed under attention that registered her without requiring anything from her. She looked back at her customer. She answered a question about the bag's interior pockets. She did her job. When she looked up again, he was gone. The staff meeting was called for the following morning, before the mall opened. Every employee in every store was required to attend. This itself was unusual. Meridian had never operated as a unified entity in that way, each boutique functioning in its own sphere with its own management and its own logic. The new summons suggested something had fundamentally changed in the structure, and the staff who filed into the central atrium that morning carried the specific anxiety of people who understand that change at the top rarely means improvement at the bottom. Catherine arrived exactly on time. She found a place near the back of the assembled crowd, close enough to hear without being conspicuous, which was the position she had learned to occupy in most rooms. Vladimir Kozakov appeared from the administrative corridor beside the atrium with the same quiet precision she was beginning to associate with him. He stood at the front of the assembled staff without a microphone, and the space around him simply went quiet, not because he demanded it, but because his presence made noise feel inappropriate. He spoke without preamble. He introduced himself. He confirmed the acquisition. He outlined, in language that was direct without being brutal, the changes that would follow. Several management positions across the mall would be restructured. Performance reviews would be conducted for all senior staff within the week. Standards of customer conduct would be revised and implemented immediately. He spoke about the experience of every person who walked through the building's doors, not with corporate enthusiasm, but with a measured seriousness that made clear this was not a speech about branding. It was a statement of expectation. Catherine listened and heard, underneath the organized language, something she hadn't anticipated, a specific kind of ethics. Not sentimentality. Not moralizing. But a clear and unsentimental view that a workplace in which some people's dignity was routinely managed downward was a workplace that functioned badly, and that dysfunction was, in his view, a structural failure. He did not use those exact words. He didn't need to. When he finished, he asked if there were questions. The silence that followed was the silence of a crowd that has understood the room and decided uncertainty is not the time to distinguish yourself. One regional manager raised a mild procedural question about the review schedule. Kozakov answered it in 2 sentences. Then his gaze moved briefly through the crowd, not searching, not lingering, and Catherine had the irrational sense, again, of being individually registered within the whole. She told herself it was a psychological response to stress. She was reasonably confident she was right. She went back to her boutique and folded cashmere sweaters and waited to understand what came next. The first review was Cecile's. Catherine learned this the way she learned most things at Prestige and Company, indirectly, through the texture of the day. Cecile disappeared into a meeting on Thursday morning and returned 3 hours later with the particular silence of someone who has had a significant conversation and is still processing what it cost them. She moved through the boutique differently for the rest of the day, less declaratively, her usual quiet authority replaced by something that looked like recalibration. She did not mention the meeting to Catherine. What she did, the following day, was recommend Catherine for an administrative role in the new ownership's transitional team. Catherine received this news in the same back office where she had been corrected about Mrs. Hartwell and the ill-fitting dress. Cecile phrased it in the language of opportunity. She said that Catherine's attention to client needs had been noted. She said the new management was building a team to handle direct operations during the restructuring period and that Prestige and Company was being asked to put forward 1 staff member for consideration. Catherine looked at the woman across the desk and understood several things simultaneously, that this recommendation was not generosity, that it was most likely Cecile managing her own situation by placing Catherine at the front of whatever uncertainty the restructuring represented, and that it was also, despite all of that, a genuine opening. "I'll consider it," Catherine said. She considered it for approximately 6 hours, which was the amount of time it took her to acknowledge that the alternative, remaining in the boutique under whatever new version of the old arrangement the restructuring produced, offered no real guarantee of improvement either. She submitted her name. 3 days later, she was asked to come to the administrative offices. The offices occupied a floor of the building that most of the mall's retail staff had never accessed, a floor of meeting rooms and quiet corridors that smelled of coffee and neutral carpet and the specific kind of ambient pressure that accumulates in spaces where decisions are made. Catherine was met by a woman named Yara, who managed Kozakov's operational calendar with the systematic precision of someone who has learned that the closest thing to peace is an organized schedule. Yara explained the role. It was transitional project coordination, managing the implementation of new operational standards across the mall's boutiques, serving as a point of contact between the ownership team and individual store management, reviewing staff complaint records and flagging patterns that warranted attention. The work was structured and specific and carried with it access to a level of information about Meridian's internal workings that Catherine had never previously had any reason to want. She noticed, reading the role description, that the complaint review component was not incidental. It was central. Someone had designed this position with the explicit intent of having it locate the places where the building's professional culture had been managed in ways that didn't bear scrutiny. She thought about Mrs. Hartwell. She thought about 3 years of suggestions absorbed into silence. She thought about Cecile's hands folded on the desk. When would the role begin, she asked. Immediately, Yara said. Catherine started the following Monday. She did not see Vladimir Kozakov for the first 2 weeks of the role. She knew he was present in the building, his operational footprint was visible in the decisions that reached her desk, in the standards that had been revised, in the pace at which the restructuring was moving, which was deliberate but inexorable, like a tide. But their paths did not intersect directly, and she told herself, grateful for that. The work itself was enough to manage. The complaint records were illuminating in the way that things are illuminating when you understand them not as individual incidents but as a pattern. Across 7 of the mall's 12 boutiques, the records told a consistent story. Staff members in customer-facing roles who had been repeatedly disciplined for assertiveness, for exceeding their advisory function, for creating friction with high-value clients. The language varied by boutique but the structure was the same. And the staff members flagged most consistently. Catherine reviewed the files for several evenings without letting herself stop, shared certain characteristics. They were not random. She wrote her first formal report carefully. She chose words that documented the pattern without editorializing. She included supporting evidence. She noted the dates. She noted the specific language used in each disciplinary record. She submitted it through the appropriate channel and waited. The response came from Yara. The report had been received. It had been forwarded to Mr. Kozakov directly. Catherine went back to work. She was cross-referencing a set of financial discrepancy records on a Wednesday afternoon when the office door opened. She registered the sound without looking up, expecting Yara, and then registered the difference in the quality of the silence that followed the door opening, the particular way certain presences reorganized the air around them, and looked up. Vladimir Kozakov stood in the doorway of the administrative office she had been assigned, one hand resting on the frame, his attention already on her with the same directness she had observed from the atrium on that first morning. He was in slightly different clothes, still charcoal, still impeccable, the collar of his shirt open by one button in a way that might have been deliberate or might have been the afternoon, but carried himself with exactly the same gravitational certainty. Your report, he said. No introduction. No greeting. Just the subject, as if they had been in the middle of a conversation he was resuming. Catherine set down her pen. Yes. He came into the room fully then, not requesting permission, but also not ignoring the fact of her presence in the space. He picked up the printed copy of her report from the corner of the desk, she had not known he had one, and turned a page. She watched him read. His face gave nothing away except the fact of reading. You were specific, he said finally. Not a question. The pattern was specific, she said. I documented what the records showed. He looked at her. It was the most direct attention she had received from another person in a professional context in some time, and she held it without looking away, which cost her something she didn't entirely want to name. 7 boutiques, he said. 7, she confirmed. With a consistent disciplinary framework applied to a consistent demographic of employee. The records don't use the language explicitly, but the pattern. I read the pattern. A silence. Not uncomfortable, or not only uncomfortable. Something else too, something that sat in the space between 2 people who have each registered the other accurately and are deciding what to do with that information. What outcome were you expecting? He asked. When you submitted this. It was a genuine question. She could hear that it was genuine, which was its own kind of disorienting. Accountability, she said. Structural change to the review process so it can't be used this way again. And consequences for the senior staff who administered it. In that order? In any order that results in all 3. He studied her for a moment with an expression she couldn't fully read, something in the vicinity of assessment, but not unkind. Then he set the report back on the corner of her desk with the same care with which he had picked it up, and he left. She sat very still for a moment after the door closed, then looked back at her screen. Her hands, she noticed, were entirely steady. She was not sure how to feel about that. 3 of the boutique managers were removed from their roles by the end of that week. Cecile was not among them. Cecile, Catherine gathered through the operational updates that came through her desk, had received a formal warning and a significant reduction in her authority over personnel decisions. Whether that was better or worse than removal was a question Catherine turned over once or twice and then set aside. It was not her decision. It was the correct decision, given the specificity of what the records showed and what they didn't. She had submitted documentation, not judgment. The line between the two mattered to her. What changed in the weeks that followed was harder to describe than a series of decisions or events. It was more like a shift in the texture of the building itself, the way spaces feel different when the power within them is restructured. Catherine noticed it in the way other staff members spoke to her, with a directness that hadn't previously been available. She noticed it in the way she moved through the mall's corridors, not differently exactly, but with less of the specific weight of knowing that the space was arranged against her. She also began, without quite deciding to notice Vladimir Kozakov more carefully. This was partly unavoidable. Their work overlapped, and his presence in the administrative floor had increased as the restructuring accelerated. She learned the rhythms of his day without meaning to, the early morning hours when he was in meetings she wasn't part of, the midday window when he sometimes reviewed materials in the open conference room with the door halfway open, the late afternoons when the building around him quieted and he seemed most genuinely alone. She learned other things too. That he listened to people, genuinely listened, with the kind of full attention that most people in authority had abandoned somewhere along the way because it was expensive and he apparently was willing to spend it. That he was harder on mistakes of character than on mistakes of judgment, which she thought was the right order of severity and which surprised her because she hadn't expected him to understand the distinction. That the men who worked with him deferred to him not out of fear but out of something more complicated, a combination of respect and awareness of what he was capable of, which is not the same thing as fear but lives in the same neighborhood. She did not let herself wonder too directly about the other neighborhood he came from. She had chosen this role with her eyes open, which meant she had also chosen not to examine certain aspects of what it adjacent to. She was good at locating the exact line between understanding and knowing, and staying just this side of it. She had always been good at that. What she was less good at, it turned out, was staying fully on her side of what was beginning to happen between them. It was a small thing, the first time. She was working late, a Thursday, the mall already closed, the atrium below dark and quiet and beautiful in the way enclosed spaces sometimes are when they've been emptied of their intended purpose. She was reviewing financial records that didn't quite balance and trying to determine whether the imbalance was administrative error or something more deliberate. The work required concentration, and she had been at it long enough that the light outside the windows had shifted from dusk to the particular deep blue of a city night. She heard his footsteps in the corridor before she saw him. She had learned the particular rhythm of them without meaning to, and then he appeared in the doorway of the conference room where she had spread her work across the long table. He looked at the spread of documents, then at her, with an expression that acknowledged her presence without being surprised by it. "You stayed," he said. "The numbers aren't matching," she said. "I'd rather find out why tonight than explain tomorrow why I didn't." He came into the room and sat down at the table, not across from her but at a right angle to the corner where she was working, which was either coincidence or a choice that would allow him to see the documents without being directly opposite her. She wasn't certain which it was, and the uncertainty itself was a small, quiet thing she noticed and then set aside. He looked at the records she had spread out. "Show me." So she showed him. She walked him through the discrepancy, where the numbers diverged, which records were involved, what the two most probable explanations were. He listened without interrupting, which she had come to understand was his way of paying attention. Occasionally he asked a question that cut precisely to the part of the analysis she was least certain about, not to undermine it but to locate the edges of what she actually knew. By the time they had worked through it together, the imbalance turned out to be a layered administrative error, 3 separate mistakes that had compounded each other over 6 months. It was nearly 10 o'clock, and the building outside the conference room was entirely silent. She gathered the documents into their relevant piles. He remained seated, his jacket draped over the chair back, his attention resting on the middle distance in a way that suggested he was still processing something, not the financial records, but something adjacent to them, or maybe something entirely different. "You grew up in this city," he said. It wasn't a question. She paused in her organizing. "Yes. It shows. The way you navigate the building." He didn't elaborate. She wasn't certain how to respond to being seen that precisely, not seen through, but seen as. "You didn't grow up here," she said. It was as much question as statement. "No." A pause. "I grew up somewhere that also leaves marks." It was the most personal thing he had said to her in the 6 weeks she had known him, and it was not very personal at all, which was how she understood it was genuine. People who were performing intimacy offered more. People who were actually allowing it offered just the edge of it, and trusted the other person to understand. She understood. She finished gathering her documents. "Good night, Mr. Kozakov," she said. "Good night," he said. And then, after a beat that she felt rather than heard, "Catherine." She walked out of the conference room and down the quiet corridor and did not let herself do anything with the sound of her name in that particular register until she was in the elevator and the doors had closed. She was not naive. She spent the following week being deliberately, methodically not naive. She enumerated the reasons this was inadvisable: the power differential, the professional context, the world he came from, and what adjacency to it had always cost people who entered it without full knowledge of what they were entering. She was good with records. She knew how to read patterns. The pattern here was clear. She also, and this was the part she found hardest to dismiss, read people well. And what she read in him, in the moments when the authority stepped back just far enough to reveal what was beneath it, was not performance. Was not strategy. Was something real, and real things, she had learned, cost something. She was thinking about this, distantly, while completing a set of contractor reviews on a Tuesday afternoon, when Yara appeared in her doorway with an expression that carried information. "There's been an incident," Yara said. "Not in the building. Adjacent to the building's interests." She paused. "Mr. Kozakov has asked if you'd be available to meet with him this evening." Catherine set down her pen. "What kind of incident?" "The kind that will require careful handling." Yara's tone was precise and uninflected, which told Catherine the information had been deliberately limited. "He'll explain when you meet." She agreed to the meeting. It was held not in the administrative offices but in a room on the building's top floor that she hadn't previously been in, a space that looked like neither a conference room nor an office but something in between, with large windows that looked out over the city at night and furniture arranged for conversation rather than presentation. There was coffee on a small table. There were 2 chairs positioned to face each other at an angle that was neither confrontational nor comfortable. He was already there when she arrived. His jacket was on this time, his posture formal in the particular way it became when the weight of something was bearing on him, not visibly, but in the precision of his stillness, which increased when the circumstances required more from him. He told her about the situation without preamble, which she had come to understand was a form of respect from him, the acknowledgement that she could receive information directly without requiring it to be softened. One of the boutique managers who had been removed during the restructuring, a man named Aldrin who had overseen 2 of the boutiques with the most consistent misconduct records, had filed a legal challenge to his termination. The challenge was not strong, legally, and Kozakov's team was handling it. But Aldrin had also, in preparing his defense, made a series of inquiries that were less about the legal challenge and more about what had generated it, specifically, about the report that had been submitted and by whom. He looked at her steadily. "He has identified you as the author." She absorbed this. She had known it was possible. The report had not been anonymous, only formally submitted through official channels. She had made that choice knowing what it implied. "Is there a concern about what he does with that information?" she asked. "There may be. I wanted you to know before it became relevant." She thought about this. About the shape of what he was telling her, which was not, "This is your problem." Was more like, "This is a thing that may reach you and I am telling you now so it reaches you through me rather than sideways." I stand by the report, she said. I know that. He said it flatly, with the specific weight of someone who has already accounted for that fact and is telling her something slightly different. I'm not asking you to reconsider it. I'm telling you I'm aware of where this may go, and I'm managing it. She looked at him across the space of the two chairs angled toward each other. The city was lit and dark behind the windows, layered and continuous, the way cities always are. You could have sent Yara to tell me this, she said. A pause. A brief one. I could have. She did not ask the follow-up question. He did not offer the follow-up answer. They sat inside that exchange for a moment, and the weight of what was unspoken between them was not uncomfortable in the way silence is uncomfortable when there is nothing behind it. It was uncomfortable in the way of a room that is too warm, which is a different thing entirely. Thank you for telling me yourself, she said. He nodded once, the way he acknowledged things that did not require elaboration. She left. She walked home through the city instead of calling a car, which she did sometimes when she needed the air and the movement and the particular anonymity of being a person in motion. She thought about the situation. She also thought about two chairs angled toward each other and the difference between having Yara deliver a message and choosing not to. She thought about these two things separately and in parallel, as carefully as she had reviewed those financial records, and arrived home without a conclusion she was prepared to name. The Aldrin situation resolved in 3 weeks, not through legal action. The challenge was, as Kazakov's team had indicated, without foundation, but through a separate resolution Catherine was not fully briefed on, the terms of which she did not inquire about. She understood there were rooms she did not enter and decisions made in them that she did not need to witness. She had located her line and she stayed on her side of it. That was the arrangement, even if it was an arrangement no one had formally articulated. What changed after the Aldrin situation was harder to name than any specific event. It was the way he greeted her now when they passed in the administrative corridor, no longer simply acknowledging but something slightly fuller, a second of attention that was too brief to be significant and too consistent to be incidental. It was the way their working conversations had developed a different texture, still professional, still boundaried, but with slightly more space within the professionalism, the way a formal garden has geometry but also leaves room for something to grow according to its own nature. It was, she admitted to herself one Friday afternoon while reviewing contractor schedules, the fact that she knew how he took his coffee and he knew she didn't drink it after 2 in the afternoon and neither of them had made any particular effort to acquire this information. It had simply accumulated. She was thinking about accumulated things when he appeared in her office doorway on a Friday in early November, the building nearly empty of its weekly population, the light outside showing the first true darkness of an autumn evening. The atrium, he said. When you have a moment. She followed him down to the ground floor, which she had not expected, and found the atrium lit in the way it was sometimes lit after hours, the architectural lighting that came on automatically, designed to show the building's bones without the overlay of its commercial purpose. It was, she thought, the most honest the space ever looked. He had a tablet with him and brought up a proposed redesign for the atrium layout, a structural change to how the ground floor organized itself that would affect traffic flow and several of the boutique entrances. He wanted her read on how the change would impact the operational patterns she had spent 3 months documenting. She looked at the design. She walked the space with him, pointing to the areas where she thought the traffic modeling was optimistic, where the change to one boutique entrance would create a bottleneck, where a small adjustment to a corridor width would solve a problem 3 floors up. He listened with the full attention quality she still found quietly startling after all these weeks. He pushed back twice, once with a logistical argument she didn't have an immediate answer for, once with a consideration about one of the boutique tenants that she incorporated and improved. By the time they had talked through the whole floor, the tablet was covered in her notation marks and his, overlapping in the way of 2 people who have found the same shorthand without negotiating it. She realized, standing in the quiet atrium with the architectural lighting showing the marble and the geometry of the space, that she was not afraid of him. Not in any version of the word. She had thought, in the early weeks, that proximity to his world would generate a specific kind of fear, not of him personally, but of what he represented, of what that world did to the people who were adjacent to it. And there was caution, still, she was not reckless, had never been reckless, but fear was not the word. What she felt in his presence was something more like the feeling of standing next to something very powerful and very contained, and understanding that the containment was real, even if it required significant effort to maintain. She also understood, in that moment in the atrium, that he had chosen to show her that effort on occasion. The evenings when the formality dropped by a degree. The information delivered in person rather than through Yara. The two chairs angled toward each other. She was not naive. She also was not blind. "This is a significant change," she said, looking at the floor plan on the tablet. "Most significant changes are," he said. She looked at him. He was looking at the atrium, not at her, looking at the space with the expression of someone who is not only seeing what exists but what might. "You're going to change this whole building," she said. Not a complaint. An observation. "I already have," he said. Then he looked at her. "Some of it." The weight of the second sentence was not about the building, and they both understood that, and they let it rest between them in the way of the atrium's quiet, visible, undemanding, already part of the room. She told herself a number of things over the following weeks. She told herself she was a professional. She told herself the circumstances were not simple. She told herself that attraction was not a decision and that what she did with it was, and that she had always been good at making decisions that cost her something in the short term in exchange for things that mattered in the long one. She told herself all of these things sincerely and believed them all. And then she also allowed, in the hours when she was most honest with herself, usually late, usually in the particular silence of her apartment after a day in which she had been near him and careful and professional and very conscious of both, that the decision was becoming less abstract. What made it complicated, she understood, was not the power differential or the professional context or the world he came from, though all of those were real. What made it complicated was that she respected him. Not despite what she knew of him. Because of what she knew of him, which was specific and informed and not romanticized. He was not simple. He operated in registers she would never fully access. He carried weight she would never completely understand. And he had, in the months she had worked beside him, demonstrated a way of being in the world, careful, principled in his own register, attentive to certain kinds of truth, that she found, against every reasonable reservation, genuinely compelling. That was the part that made the decision real. December came with cold and the mall's seasonal transformation, the kind of decorative overlay that made Meridian look briefly less like an architectural argument and more like something warmer. Catherine had been reviewing end-of-year operational summaries for a week and was beginning to understand, through the data, the full shape of what the restructuring had actually accomplished. Turnover among high-performing staff had dropped significantly. Complaint resolution time had decreased. 3 of the boutiques that had been flagged in her initial report were now outperforming their previous metrics by margins that were documented and real. She was thinking about this when Yara delivered a small wrapped parcel to her desk with the information that it had been left for her by Mr. Kuzakov. She opened it carefully. Inside was a book, a collection of essays on the architecture of public spaces, their design, and what they implied about the values of the people who built them. It was not a new book, not a bestseller, the kind of thing you find by knowing what you're looking for rather than by following any list. On the inside cover, in handwriting that was controlled and European in character, was a single line, because of the atrium conversation. She sat with the book in her hands for a long moment. Then she went to find him. He was in the conference room with the half-open door, alone, reviewing documents with the focused stillness of a person entirely absorbed. She knocked on the frame. He looked up. "Thank you," she said. "For the book." He looked at her steadily. "I thought you'd use it." "I will." A pause. She made the decision the way she made most significant decisions, by acknowledging that she had already made it and was simply naming it. "I think we should talk. Outside of this." She gestured, meaning the building, the roles, the professional architecture of the past 4 months. He was quiet for a moment with that quality of stillness that was never emptiness, always something being held with deliberate care. "Yes," he said. "I think so too." It was not simple after that. It was never going to be simple, and they were both too clear-eyed to pretend otherwise. They had dinner once, then twice, in quiet places she chose and he did not object to, she had insisted on choosing, which he had acknowledged with the specific silence of someone understanding exactly why and respecting it. Their conversations were long and uneven in the way of two people who are genuinely learning each other rather than performing the learning. He spoke about the city he had grown up in, not often, not at length, but with the precision of someone who has decided that selective truth is still a form of truth. She spoke about her own history with an honesty that she had not practiced in a long time, because it had not previously felt safe to practice. There were difficult conversations about what his world was and what it cost and what proximity to it meant for anyone who mattered to him. She did not pretend she was comfortable with all of it. He did not pretend it was less than what it was. They negotiated, which is what honest people do when they want something that requires negotiation. He was not always easy. She was not always patient. There were weeks when the weight of what he carried made him closed in a way that pressed against everything, and she learned, slowly, which pressure was hers to respond to and which was not, which was the hardest lesson of being near someone who held a great deal and shared it sparingly. She also learned, in the way you learn things that matter, that the vulnerability she had observed in him, the precise moments when the authority stepped back, was not performance and was not weakness. It was what he allowed in spaces he had decided were safe. And he had decided, with the same deliberate calculation he applied to everything, that the space between them was one of those. That was not a small thing. For him, she understood, it was not a small thing at all. By spring, the restructuring of Meridian was largely complete. The mall operated differently, not dramatically, not in ways that a casual visitor would necessarily identify, but in ways that the people who worked within it felt daily. The complaint structure had been redesigned. The performance review process had been rebuilt. The boutiques that had functioned as small private hierarchies, with their specific and documented costs to the people inside them, had been reorganized with oversight that actually worked. Catherine's role had evolved alongside the restructuring. She was no longer managing a transitional project. She was running operations, which was a different thing, less about implementing change and more about maintaining what the change had built. She had a small team now, 3 people who had been identified during the review process as exactly the kind of employees the old system had been misusing. She was not sentimental about this. She was precise. She and Vladimir Kozakov were, by spring, in the specific and unspectacular reality of 2 people who have found each other through a set of circumstances that were not designed for finding anyone, and have chosen to remain there. This was not a fairy tale version of the thing. It was something quieter and more demanding and considerably more real. There were evenings of genuine ease and evenings of genuine difficulty and the entire middle register of an ordinary complicated life that exists between those 2 poles. He had never become simple. She had never expected him to. She had not simplified for him either, and he had not asked her to, which was the foundation of whatever they were building in the space between 2 people who are honest about what they are. One evening in late April, they were walking through the atrium after hours, a habit they had developed, the building quiet around them, the architectural lighting showing the marble, and he stopped without particular reason at the center of the space and looked up at the second floor, at the glass-fronted boutique where she had once stood folding cashmere sweaters and watching him from the periphery of a room. "You were watching," he said. "That first day." She looked at him. "So were you." He said nothing, which was his version of acknowledging she was right. She looked up at the boutique too, then around at the atrium, at the space as it now was, reorganized and illuminated, still itself but differently itself. Changed by things that had happened in it and to it and because of it. "Did you know," she asked, "what you'd find here?" He was quiet for a moment. "I knew what I was looking for," he said. "I didn't know where I'd find it." She looked at him in the light that showed the building's bones. He was looking at the atrium, at the space, at some combination of the present and the possible that she couldn't fully see but could feel in the quality of his stillness, which was, she had learned, where everything he couldn't say lived. "I'm glad it was here," she said. He looked at her then, in the way he looked at her in the moments that were his version of openness, which were not dramatic and were not performed and were, for exactly those reasons, more real than most things she had been given. "So am I," he said. The atrium held them in its quiet. The city went on outside the building's walls, loud and layered and continuous. And inside the space that had been bought and changed and restructured into something closer to what it should have always been, they stood, two people at the center of it, carrying the weight of everything they were and choosing, still, to be exactly where they were. Hi, my loves. If you've made it here, all the way to the end, then you know that this story wasn't really about a mall. Or a billionaire. Or a power move. It was about something much quieter than that. It was about what it feels like to be seen in a room where you've spent years being looked through. It was about the strange, inconvenient, impossible to schedule moment when someone actually registers you, and you don't quite know what to do with that, and neither do they, and somehow that shared uncertainty becomes the most honest thing in the room. It was about Catherine, who knew her worth when no one in that building was willing to confirm it, and kept showing up anyway. And about Vladimir, who came with all that weight and all that silence and chose, in his careful, controlled, fractured way, to let one person see what was underneath. I don't write about perfect people. I don't know any. I write about people doing their imperfect best with the materials they have and the histories they carry, and I hope that somewhere in these stories you find something that sounds like your own life, even if the setting is nothing like it. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening all the way to the last word, in the quiet, wherever you are right now. I see you. Tell me in the comments what stayed with you. What you felt. What you saw in Catherine that maybe you've seen in yourself. I read every single one, even when I don't say so. Until the next story, take care of yourself. You deserve to be seen too.